Hello, everyone. Hello. Okay, we're settling down. Okay, we're going to get started. Um, Welcome, everyone. I'm Huma Gupta, the assistant professor in the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture here. It's such a pleasure to see so many faces here today and all the people joining online for our first lecture in the Spring ACPIA series, which is also co-sponsored with the Department of Architecture. And I wanted to encourage all of you to come to the next lectures in the ACPIA series, which will be held on March 11th with Yuka Kadoy, April 8th with Patricia Blessing, and April 29th with Roberto Fabri. I also wanted to take a minute to thank my colleagues, Azra Akshamia, Nasser Abad, Diana Rooney, our department head, Nicholas de Monchot, communications head, Joelle Carella, and of course, the members of the Exhibitions and Lectures Committee, chaired by Yolande Daniels, for all their support in putting this event together. I'm also especially happy today because I invited our guests to give this lecture last spring, and after one whole year of waiting, Léopold Lambert, the editor-in-chief of the Funambulist, is finally here with us. I know that, like myself, many of my students and colleagues are avid readers since the Funambulist first started as a blog in 2010 and later a bi-monthly magazine in 2015. Today, they have published more than 50 issues with over 650 contributors and have 4,000 subscribers and growing across the world. Many of our graduates have also published in the magazine, such as Ana Maria Leon, Mohammed Nahle, Mona Fawaz, Gareen Bogassian, Jessica Khazrik, Manar Morsi, and Maryam Sultan. And many of the guests that we've invited to lecture here previously, such as cooking sections, Charmaine Shua, Mena Aga, Anuradha Ayer Siddiqui, Samia Henny, and David Gisson, have also been featured in the magazine. I mention these names because it demonstrates the important role that the Funambulist occupies as a space of critical and political analysis by bringing together students, scholars, organizers, and designers to share how they engage with the field of architecture, and specifically its complicity with regimes and technologies of power. Léopold organizes the magazine's themes sometimes around places or landscapes, such as the issue on the subcontinent, or desert, islands, forest struggles, suburban geographies. There are also issues organized around events, such as the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, or Our Battles. Some themes focus on objects and materials, like clothing politics and object politics. And there are issues that analyze space through the lens of ableism, incarceration, settler colonialism, and technologies of power, such as cartography. I have also appreciated the emphasis on internationalist solidarity in the magazine, which challenges readers to think beyond their own contexts, their own histories, their own identities, ecologies, species, and struggles, most importantly, their own egos, and find connection across perceived differences. Hear the words of Stephanie K. Dunning always ring loudly in my ears. May our egos die so that the world may live. What intrigues me is, of course, why and how did Léopold, a trained architect based in Paris, choose to start this project, a project now published in English and French and soon Spanish, and how he conceptualizes his role and responsibility as an editor, which might differ from his role as a writer who has published books like States of Emergency, A Spatial History of the French Colonial Continuum in 2021, Bulldozer Politics, The Palestinian Ruin as an Israeli Project in 2016, and he is currently working on a book that investigates the key and the spoon as two objects that not only mobilize architecture's political violence, but also offer an escape from it. And I think it's perhaps this current project that intrigues me the most because it points to the paradoxical position of architecture, design, and I would add the craft of history writing in our world, because the transformative process or promise that our fields offer also frequently lead them to uphold a deeply unjust status quo. Whether you agree with the Funambulist's positions or not, it has a clear editorial voice that is articulated through thousands of small choices and decisions, a voice which invites and provokes authentic discussion. I think that one of the hardest things to do and to teach is how to find one's authorial voice, and especially when that voice is in conversation with thousands of people across the world who might not agree with you. But I take inspiration not only from Léopold, who gives us the image of the tightrope walker with the title Funambulist, but many of our own colleagues who, through writing op-eds, thinking of Carlo and Nasser here, or recording podcasts like Anna Miljacki, crafting essays like Garnett, provide different models of public engagement that not only offers critique, but is also ready to accept it. With that, I would like to invite Léopold to take the stage. Please give him a big round of applause.
Thank you so much, Huma, for this very thorough and thoughtful introduction. I feel half of the talk is already done. Yeah, a big, huge thank you for the invitation. I will say I'm not responsible for the fact that it took a full year. But I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank the rest of the Aga Khan program as well as the School of Architecture for welcoming me here. I have a little speech written to begin, which is maybe the most formal part of this presentation, but this is my little series of not land acknowledgements that I have in my Red Nation little red book. So here we go. This is not a land acknowledgement. When colonial institutions openly recognize that they occupy your land, it means that the battle is lost, although perhaps not forever. On the contrary, when one of these institutions feel obliged to dissolve the student groups that protest the genocide, we can know for sure that the anti-colonial fight is still winnable and that it shall be won. This is not a land acknowledgement, but please allow me a time acknowledgement. As I speak, the 2 million inhabitants of Gaza, most of whom are refugees from the 1948 ethnic cleansing we call Nakba, are subjected to the genocidal violence of settler colonialism. That's funny, I actually wrote settler capitalism. Interesting slip-up. The exact same violence that clears the ground for the place where we are today to exist. That clears the ground for the place where we are today to exist. We are in Palestine here. We are in Algeria, in Kenya, Malaya, Angola, Java, Libya, Western Sahara, West Papua, Colombia, Guatemala, Australia, Aotearoa, Chechnya, Armenia, Korea, South Africa, and Bolivia. The Mississippi River and the Congo River are connected through the Black Atlantic and its Middle Passage. Guam, Samoa, Puerto Rico, Guantanamo, Hawaii, Chagos, and Okinawa. The settler colony is also an empire. We are here and we are there. Facing this reality, we must be here and there in solidarity with those who fight to dismantle the colonial structures that surround us. Let's force this institution to no longer acknowledge the so-called painful history of our defeats and instead recognize the inexorability of our political victories. Okay. So back to it. And yeah, today the talk will be specifically on the magazine, the Key and the Spoon. If some of you are in New York on Monday, you can come to Pratt for a presentation of that book project. But yeah, as Huma was kindly reminding, I am a trained architect, which means that I had a period of my life where I was still designing things, and I'm still interested in this idea, even though I'm not really doing it anymore. But I think in an architecture school, for me, it's always important to go back to it just a tiny bit as something that is inherently imperfect. When we design, we take risk. We sort of allow ourselves to be vulnerable facing the sort of criticality of theory, but I think it's important. And indeed, the various sort of arguments around architecture that I've been trying to articulate in the past 15 years have been the subject of some books, such as this one, Weaponized Architecture, The Impossibility of Innocence, that I wrote now 14 years ago, so needless to say, I'm absolutely unable to reread it today. Or the bulldozer politics one, and most recently the one that took me 5 years to write, and that is being currently translated into English, which I'm very much rejoicing about. I don't know how confidential it is, but one of the graduates that Huma kindly named is actually involved in that work of translation at the moment. So if you know, you know. But so going to the Funambulist, it is indeed a project that started under that name in 2010, although a little blog existed before that when I was still in undergrad in Paris. It was this beautiful design, as you can see at first, very WordPress looking, with various evolution. I mean, here's two of them, but it mostly consisted in, at first, in like my own writings, trying to address perhaps a lack of not. It's not that there was necessarily a lack of a political discourse around architecture. I think it would be a little bit ridiculous to say so, but perhaps not so one that did not, maybe a lack for a discourse that would really situate architects and architecture as complicit with political regimes of oppression, in particular settler colonialism. So this is something that I tried to do in a very, in a very clumsy way for many years, and still today, it's always trying to address this clumsiness without really necessarily managing to do so. But I guess this also happened in perhaps around the time where ArcDaily and Dizine were like exploding, and there was like the attention span for things online were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I remember specifically at some point in 2010 vowing to be as boring as I can in writing text and forcing people to spend at least 5 minutes on things and trying to reflect on them. And that later led to perhaps, that later led to this collaboration with Plankton Books, with those little pamphlets that try to collect some of those writings around particular topics, and as you can see, but also with the ancestor of the magazine that was called the Funambulist Papers back then, that essentially consisted in commissioning a few texts to some friends around various topics, and that were collected in those 2 volumes. And then back then I was working in an office in New York, and I got fired in a very New York way that for a European is always quite shocking. And I spare you the detail, but I think even you would be shocked. But the fact of the matter is, once I secured my visa, I was able to maybe have a little bit more time to spend on the Funambulist, and started this podcast that is now the Funambulist podcast, but that back then was called Archipelago, where I was able to pretty much send emails to people whose work I thought was incredibly rich, and ask them if I could interview them, and most of the time they would say yes, which to me is still like amazing. And so back in the days there was 2 episodes per week, so that was quite prolific. And then I came back to France in 2014 and didn't really want to work for anyone but myself anymore, and try to wonder how I can build an ambitious project based on what was already the Funambulist back then, but also something that would generate its own economy to be able to, first of all, for the project itself to be able to sustain itself, but also to be able to sustain me, and then perhaps other people. I mean, at the moment, there's 2 of us full-time on it. So that led to this to the creation of this magazine that comes out every other month, around one particular question, and you can see those are the 2 first years, and you can see they're still they sort of involve the architecture in a fairly explicit way at the beginning, and I think little by little it was less and less centered on the question of architecture in the most sort of literal way. You know, it grew little by little. It's very much, I mean, I can talk about it later, but it's very much a model based on subscriptions, and so it was a very slow growth, but a very steady growth as well. So it's been interesting. Those are the 3 last issues within this graphic design, including the one that the amazing Zoe Samutzi did while I was taking my parental break back in 2021. And then the last one of that series was the ocean, that I will talk about just a little bit more later. But then later on, we had a new format, so in 2022, so actually not so old, but we've had already quite a few issues in that new format. This is something also, maybe in an architecture school, it's interesting to say that, is that I always make that joke saying that as architects, we have the particularity of being mediocre at everything, but like we're mediocre at everything. So it's, you know, it's mediocre, but it's like there's so many things we're able to do with our skills, including graphic design or putting a publication together, writing even though architects' writing is also something, myself very much included. And so, so somehow with the skills you acquire at school, you're sort of able to already do something that might be, you know, far from perfect. But as I was telling Huma earlier today, is like I'm a done is better than perfect kind of person. So I guess that worked well for it. So some of the recent issue, including the one that my colleague Shivangi Mariamraj and myself did together around the politics of the subcontinent. Some more recent one. I will go a little bit more into some of those in just a second, and then you know, for it not to be the equivalent of, you know, when architects come to you and do a lecture and basically connect on their website and show you projects that you can just see by yourself. all that well. I will talk to you more about what I call the politics of production of the magazine. So what's behind the scenes, so to speak, that you cannot maybe as readily see on a website than the content itself. And those are the most recent one, including our January-February issue. And so so going back to a few issues to perhaps present a little bit the sort of editorial arguments that I've been trying to push for. That one, the ocean, is still one of my real favorite one, whereby it consisted in trying to associate the epistemology created in the North Atlantic, so very much epistemologies of blackness that are built on as a foundation with foundation the transatlantic slave trade, but also recognizing that if we are to talk about ocean, then indeed because of U.S. and European, well, North American and European sort of infrastructure of knowledge production, then the North Atlantic epistemology tend to be a little bit central to the way we would approach oceanic epistemologies. And so I really wanted for Oceania to be extremely present in it, and in particular also thinking about blackness in Melanesia, in Oceania, but also the Indian Ocean, and even questioning the very name of the Indian Ocean, like it's a strange name. And talking about the history of anti-colonial struggle in Oceania, and various other things. But it's been really a beautiful issue to put together, and with wonderful contributors. This one, going a little bit closer to us, this is from May 2022, was an attempt to say that, I mean, you know, all of you here live in the US, so it's a little bit different, but for those of us who do not live in the US and have to live with the prominence of US epistemologies, including, I mean, you know, I'm not, when I say that, I don't mean McDonald's, Hollywood, and you know, the Democratic Party. I mean, I mean us. And so how do we think through blackness, queerness, brownness, caste and indigeneity from epistemologies that are not produced in and from the US, which led to difficult questions that I think the difficulty of the questions is also interesting because it also means that the audience that the magazine has been cultivated over the years, and it is an audience with whom we are able to have like a serious conversation that among ourselves, so to speak. So, you know, with, you know, difficult questions such as why is global blackness mostly influenced by an African American epistemology, for example, which is, you know, not an easy question, especially for a white editor to be asking, but yet I think an important question to be. And of course, I'm not the one writing the text, so it's also about commissioning the right people to deal with this kind of questions, but also questions of exceptionality. You know, recognizing that some people, like the people in the U.S., would be like, oh, we are the worst. Like number one in the worst is like are not that different from people who are saying like, oh, we're the best. So this kind of questions, the absence of the consideration of caste in around consideration of the subcontinental diasporas, for example. The question of indigeneity in relationship to Latinidad. So yeah, this issue was also really, really beautiful to put together, and I still love it in many ways. This one as well was, I mean, I'm sort of introducing the issues that have a pretty strong and precise editorial argument. Some issues are much more open, you know, the issue on forests, the issue on deserts are wonderful issues, but as an editor, I have much less some things that I'm trying to say than just saying, hey, how about we look at the amazing political struggles that are happening from and for the forest, for example. But so that usually involved an editorial introduction from me, like a much less thorough introduction than for an issue like that, where I've been quite tyrannical with my contributors, trying to articulate a pretty precise editorial line around questions of around tough questions in relationship to solidarity practices. So there's, for example, this great piece by Laurel Masing and Daviana McGregor about how the fight against colonial nuclearism, and in particular French nuclear bombings of Polynesia in the 90s in Oceania, is a good paradigm to perhaps get rid of the idea of allyship. Like I'm someone who have like really big problems with the question of allyship. So that's a great text to really try to think through it and to see how indeed we might be willing to give it up. Questions of imperialisms not being solely like something European or North American, but also coming from other places, and all that. And there's also this format, such as this one again with Sohe Samudzi and Anaïs Duong-Podigap, which I really love to do, which are letters between contributors. So they write to each other about a particular question that I tend to induce. More recently, even July 2023, was this issue called 50 Shades of Whiteness that was trying to grapple with an understanding of whiteness that would not be a settler colonial whiteness, because I understand that in contexts such as the US or any other settler colonial context, whiteness is not really something that has much nuances, like a white settler is basically a white settler. But in various other contexts, there might be some political nuances to whiteness, and some contingencies of whiteness that are important to question. I mean, quite honestly, this issue, I felt the need to do it when I realized that even within the anti-racist movement in Europe in particular, the way that the obvious hypocrisy of European state in taking in Ukrainian refugees for the first time in a very dignifying way, but seeing that within the anti-racist movement there was of course a denunciation of the hypocrisy compared to Afghan or Syrian or Eritrean or Sudanese refugees that would not receive the same kind of welcoming in Europe, of course. But how this entire hypocrisy was revolved around the assumed whiteness of Ukrainians, which I think in the context of Europe is something that is much more contingent than we might want to admit. And what I mean by that is that at the moment, Ukrainian refugees in Europe might be indeed white in the way that whiteness is constructed politically, but I'm not. First of all, I know that it was not necessarily the case before, and I know it won't be the case in the future. So I was interested in questioning that. Also, having an actual Caucasian writer talk about the Caucasus and how a place like this one, the US, would use the word Caucasian as a signifier of whiteness when Caucasus is not even in Europe to begin with. So it's a very interesting article. The contingency of whiteness vis-a-vis Polish people at home, Polish people as a diaspora, the question of Ashkenazi Jews in South Africa during the apartheid, the question of Roma people in Europe, the question of mestizaje in Mexico, and various others like that. But it was also very. I mean, that's also the thing about after all those issues, when I do have an editorial argument I'm trying to make, that's usually more interesting for me because I get to learn so much from doing it as well. So it's that's also why more and more there's those very targeted issues. And then even more recently, our 50th issue in November 2023 tried to look at, each contribution tried to look at one particular concept, one particular term that for some of them might have lost a little bit of their political potential by becoming too mainstream, perhaps. I mean, questions of queerness, question of indigeneity, question of decoloniality. How can we reinsert some political power within those concepts, but also how words such as Nakba, Sumud, and Intifada, coming from the Palestinian struggle for liberation, are amazing words insofar as that they're never translated. Like they managed to go from Palestinian Arabic to other languages, and we use them. And when we use them, we mean exactly what they mean, and not some sort of. We don't lose any sort of political power of the term by translating it into something else, which is also something that is true for a word like banlieue in France that I'm also trying to impose within English, for example. Yeah, it was a beautiful issue, and then it's also an issue that it's also the first issue we translated into French, and so there was also something very deliberate from me to do an issue on terms and language when it was going to be the first one to be translated. So more recently, an issue on the undocumented movement and border regime. Border regime being trying to look at the space of the border as extending much beyond the line of the border, and trying to see the ubiquity of it. And then our new one that will come out in just a few days on prison uprisings with amazing contributions about the long Attica revolt, not too far from here in upstate New York, women in Kurdish women in Turkish prisons, a beautiful conversation between two former Irish political prisoners and one man and a woman, which also is an important thing. And a few other contributions in Chile, Colombia, France, Tunisia, and my own intro that tries to bring Palestine into it as well. And as I said, we have now started to translate the magazine into French, which is beyond the attempt to, I live in Paris and I'm involved with organizing in Paris. And so it's important, perhaps, and I'll come back to it at the very end, to also be able to engage locally with, with French language. But I think beyond that, it was a real attempt to sort of have a plurilingual relationship to the magazine. And so French is only the first translation, but we're now moving towards Spanish, and then, we might very well move towards Arabic, Portuguese, or Hindi, or Chinese. And then comes to what I call the politics of production, in the most literal sense, which is to begin with our office, which is this is a very wide angle, as you can tell with the flag, so it's much smaller than what it looks like. But there's two of us in it, namely, as I already cited her Shivangi Mariam Raj, our dear head of communications, and myself. And then the 5 former members of the team who've been working part-time for 1 year, 2 years in the past are now forming our advisory board, with whom we meet once a year for 2 full days to talk about what we could do better with the magazine, what kind of goals do we have in the sort of short and medium terms, and all these kind of things. And then our translators now are, of course, very central to the making of the magazine because of the different version. I mean, Chanel the Dams had been working with us regularly for quite a long time now, translating from French to English. And then Caroline Honoré and Virginie Bobin and Rosanna Puyol are translating from English to French. But the community goes much larger. It involves, of course, I think what must be close to 700 contributors by now, and it was quite beautiful to hear Huma cites quite a few of them, and to have a few of them in this room as well. And so this is. Of course, there is the sort of community making that working together on a text might create. I mean, in that case, those are actually even people who wrote maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 texts in those 52 issues. But it's also like continuous conversations around questions that some of which I've talked about here, and so there's something about the trust between those people and us, and also I value extremely the notion of kindness. So I think there is something community. I think I take seriously the word community. I know that in English it's a word that is kind of used to just say group of people in general. I mean, sometimes it means something a little bit deeper, but here I mean it a little bit deeper. And at the core of it, there is this kindness that I very much value, and that I feel sometimes are a little bit like underplayed because I don't know, like for some sort of like weird. Probably male-induced kind of idea that kindness is perhaps weakness or something like that, but I certainly do not believe that. The two sort of the two editorial objectives of the magazine is one, to be able to perhaps, describe political struggles around the world through space in either a very direct way or in an indirect way. But then the other thing is to cultivate internationalist solidarities between those struggles. And so, I think I come from a place where internationalism quite often means to talk a little bit about Palestine, to talk a little bit about Chiapas, to talk a little bit about Kurdistan, and then perhaps stop there. Maybe a little bit of Haiti and a little bit of Ghana every now and then, but that's about it. And so this is absolutely crucial for me, that we take seriously this idea of internationalism, and that we're able to mobilize a constellation of geographies and space-time and struggles around the world. So this is the sort of geographies we mobilized in our 52 first issues. And as you can see, there's a lot of dots in many places, but also there's entire regions that really don't have dots, and I'll go back to it later. So it's also a way to hold myself accountable, editorially speaking, to do this kind of map, and perhaps to break it down a little bit. I don't like those so much because they very much go back to the idea of nation state, and I feel it's a little bit silly somehow, but it is another way to sort of hold myself accountable, to sort of try to look at where we've been speaking more than others, so to speak, even at the continental scale. But this is also the problem with this kind of map, and so you see Latin America and Caribbean 13%, so you would think, oh, actually that's not too bad. But this to me hides something that has to do with what I called, that hides something that we can all call blind spots. And blind spot does not necessarily mean that it's so obvious that something is missing from the magazine editorial line, for example. But I know, because I don't read Spanish, and I haven't been that many times in my life in particular in South America, and I haven't formed any sort of community of sharing, and for me to really be influenced by a sort of South American decolonial episteme, for example. And so even though, from a strictly statistic point of view, we're not doing so bad, I know very well in myself that I do not, that I have a problem, quite simply, that I have much less in some other places. So this is also always trying to do better and to learn more, but to also never to check boxes for the sake of checking boxes, but really trying to be influenced by various political imaginaries. And talking about blind spot, and again, being at the scale of nation state, which is kind of limited, but those are the nation states that were never mobilized, those the geographies that were never mobilized in the magazine. So again, this is not, the idea is not to say okay, so this is the map of what we are going to focus on next. This would be kind of stupid to do, but this is also a way for me to always be on the lookout to not miss an opportunity where we could indeed mobilize some of those political imaginaries. And so, the question of accessibility was a quite problematic one for quite a few years when the magazine started, because because the magazine might not be that expensive, especially now in post-inflation US. I feel like whenever I'm buying a coffee, I'm like, oh wow, that's 1 month of subscription to the Funambulist that goes there. So it's whoever is able to buy themselves a coffee, then they probably would be able to, a coffee in the US would be able to subscribe to the magazine. But there are some people who literally are not able to buy themselves a coffee in the US, whether they are in the US or somewhere else. And given the content of the magazine, it's obviously particularly problematic to sort of capture that knowledge and monetize it. So one of the things that I will absolutely never call a solution, but one of the way we have practiced to do better at this is that every single time we run out of print of an issue, and we're trying to play with this as well, but like we're trying to not overprint, of course, because of that. Then we place the issue in open access on the website. So I think it is the case for about 4/5. Like out of 52 issues, I think we have 42 or 41 issues that are in open access. So it works relatively well. And then we also have sometimes, when we do an issue on Pan-Africanism, as we did with my two colleagues back then, Margarita Boaco and Caroline Honorien, we also made it a free downloadable PDF for anyone who live on the continent, or same thing for the subcontinent. And so we're same thing for the Algerian Revolution issue for people who lived in Algeria. So we also have little things like that, but I think the big one is this open access thing. And it's not perfect, far from it, but so far that's the least imperfect measure we've been taking. We do every now and then some specific project, and I have a relationship to architecture, to architecture as in the discipline, the institution, and everything that is one where I run away very fast from it every now and then come back a little bit, not as fast every now and then. But so sometimes that really makes me want to do some projects such as this one, in which Mohammed was a part of, which is just after a while, like realizing, and I think I could actually redo it today, like just realizing after a few years of having been away from schools myself, but realizing that I did know some people who had just graduated from architecture who were absolutely amazing, that blew my mind, and that are game-changing, as I said. And so it was a way to sort of feature them on a website with this little series. But actually something that I've been starting to do recently that I really like is to have actually one architecture thesis project in each of the issues we've been doing recently, and I actually love that. I mean, again, I don't want to make up a story in which there was like 5 of us at the scale of the world that in the 2000s or the late 2000s were like working on the political implication of architecture. It would be a lie to like make it such a like solitary kind of effort or anything like that. But the fact is, we were much less than today, where there's so many super interesting, amazing projects by so many people in this discipline. So I'm actually quite interested in featuring it, and I know that people who are not in architecture are very interested in that as well. The podcast still continue as the main podcast in English, with like an interview for each episode. But something that I've been trying to do is to have 2 podcasts in French since 2020. This one I particularly love, which is a way to feature the political imaginaries and the struggles of diasporas in France that are not the main diasporas that are usually perceived to be part of the anti-racist movement. I mean, specifically diasporas from North Africa, I mean, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, from the francophone West Africa and from the francophone Caribbean. There are so many more diasporas in France that are involved with their own political struggles and have their own sort of heroes and movements that we will all gain from being more familiarized within the anti-racist and the anti-colonial movement. So each of those episodes tackles one of those diasporas, and there can be more than one episode on. And so I really like it. It's also something I should say, something I haven't said yet, is that one of the it's not really an ambition, but one of the sort of the key word, the key notions through which I sort of test what I'm doing and think like, should I do it or should I not do it, is the concept of usefulness, political usefulness. And so this, to me, is immediately useful within the anti-racist movement in France. So this is also why it feels so good to do it. And then another podcast we have is specifically on this difficult word, but if you read issue 50, you'll be able to read on those quartiers populaires. Quartier is just neighborhoods, but populaire is a very hard word to translate. If you speak Spanish, then it's the same. It's populares. It means like working class, but then quartier populaire in France definitely involves the idea of a racialized working class, and then the relationship to colonialism as well. And so each of those episodes of podcast tackles one particular neighborhood somewhere in France, and try to deal with the political history of that neighborhood and how people have been organizing in various cities. Yeah, I just realized when I load this that I had two how do you call that? Two placeholders slides to not forget to talk about it, but I could have found something maybe a little bit less minimalistic, let's say. But the question of money, of course, is very important to the politics of production of the magazine. As I said, it's a magazine that is kind of almost 100% independently founded. We've had in the past a few generous grants from the Graham Foundation, but recently we've always tried to make it specific to a particular project we're trying to do. So we're very happy and grateful when we get it, but it's usually found one particular project and not the magazine as such. And so, you know, the business model of the magazine is very much built on subscriptions, which is like about 72% of our incomes. Then the sales on our websites are also a big percentage. And for example, the sales in bookstores is extremely minimal, and advertising is pretty small as well. I mean, we have a partnership with the CCA forever now, which is great. But of course, that means this thing that is quite beautiful, really. I mean, it means we always need to have more subscribers, but at the same time, it means we're supported by people directly, and therefore also are able to be fundamentally independent in our tones, or yeah, we don't feel at all any sort of dependency on anything except to be in dialogue with this community of subscribers. This also means money, also means the money that we spend, and the fact that, for example, contributors are paid since the very, very first issue of the magazine. Not necessarily a great sum. I mean, it also depends where you live, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I won't lie to you. It's not. It could be better. It's about 200 euros for like a medium-sized article and 300 for a long size. So it's not terrible, but it's not great either. I don't know, if you have more questions about money, I'm happy to answer them, because I really have zero modesty in this, and I think it's also very important. And then, yeah, as I say, the next big project will be to try to do an hispanophone version of the magazine, but as much as the francophone version of the magazine is very oriented towards people in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, because that's where we are, the hispanophone version will be very much centered on a Latin American audience, and that involves, of course, many questions that you cannot apply directly the sort of the logics we put at work for the francophone version, even though originally that was the idea of the plurilingual project. It was to build what I call an infrastructure, meaning something that you can use for one language and then you can use the same for another, and then you can replicate like that. But I think in that case we'll need to find a little bit more subtlety to it. But anyways, that was my last slide, so I thank you very much for listening so longly. Thanks. I don't know, that might have tackled quite a few questions perhaps, so I'm happy to answer them, and I'll try to not be too long so that there's more questions. Should there be a microphone? Yeah, you do have Huma. Oh. Sure.
you, everyone. Thank you so much for sort of giving us a really beautiful overview and insight into your editorial process and thinking. We're following what Nicholas Demonchaux has introduced me to, which is the Berkeley model of moderating and doing Q&As. So I'm going to ask all of you to write down your questions on these index cards that, Dina, can you help pass out? And then we're going to get started with a question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Thank you. Yeah, I'll give you a few minutes. Oh, would you like to ask something? Okay, well, maybe Nasser can start us off while people are waiting. Okay.
You can hear me from here. Can you explain to us this? Our little constellation map. I think it's mostly. I mean, it's. I mean, as you might expect, it is very much a sort of our own political subjectivity within the magazine and the sort of geographies that very much influenced the editorial line of the magazine. But there's many there that should be there. And actually, I just realized while looking at it earlier that there's been an update. So if you buy our new tote bag, like it's not exactly this one. But yeah, I think the idea of constellation is, or the idea of the archipelago, I'm very much, I have the, so the bad thing is I'm French, but the good thing is I read French, which means that I can read Edouard Glissant in his original version. So I'm very much influenced in the way Glissant think about the archipelago as like this collective identity, which is also an individual identity for each island. And so similarly, the constellation, I think, has something quite beautiful in the way that it's able to create those relationships between those different things. And then I particularly like how constellation maps also involve time within its own cartography. So, yeah. Sorry, the microphone was perfect until pretty recently. I don't know what I did wrong. Yeah. Okay. Ah, that's why. Thanks. Yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you.
As we're collecting questions, I also had a quick one for you.
The Berkeley model is essentially having other people write their question on notes and then being able to ask questions in the meantime.
Yes. Well, it also, I think, promotes a thoughtful reflection and asking of questions that are not just long-winded comments. So I appreciate the efficiency of it. But what I wanted to know about is that you've sort of grown, the magazine, let's say, has grown with the subscribers, right? There's a community also of contributors. So it seems to me that there are a lot of voices that might also be speaking back to you as editor and sort of shaping and influencing. And I'm also curious about the maybe critical voices and have there been moments in the last 10, 15 years where you've gotten pushback or there's been criticism or those blind spots, let's say, that you were mentioning have been brought to your attention that have led to shifts in the way that you've approached? Because I think that idea of like learning and growing always instead of sort of assuming that all of us are just perfect and expected to know all and do everything perfectly, so I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was talking about how there's kindness between contributors and us. And I think there's also a lot of kindness with subscribers and readers in general, although that's not always the case. And we just got an example 2 days ago of like someone who clearly thought he was at the Amazon customer service thing and was very much wanting to call my manager. So yeah, which I have zero patience for, and it's always men. Like it's always men. Anyway, most of the time it's actually extremely generous. The kind of feedback we are getting. I think the criticism we've had. Am I on? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The criticisms we've had the most frequently are the amount of typos in the in the magazine, and so we go back to the done is better than perfect model. So I'm like, yeah, I mean that's not great. If I could have no typo, I would definitely do that. But or that the language is a little bit off, and in that case, I actually don't mind that much because I mean, at the end of the day, the magazine is mostly in English and it's mostly written by people for whom English is not necessarily their first language. Um, myself very much included. And so I also don't mind this sort of clumsiness in language sometimes. I think it does something as well. In terms of editorial content, I have to say, I think because of this generosity, people have always had the patience of waiting for this blind spot perhaps to be addressed in a sort of more organic way. So that meant, I mean, you cited Garin as one of the contributors. I think Armenia has been, or Armenians to be more precise, have been a little bit of a blind spot for me at some point, which is weird because in France there's a very strong diaspora. But yeah, when there was the first Azeri invasion of Artsakh 4 years ago, I realized that I didn't have the right tools to sort of be a good editor when it came to the Armenian struggle, and so I tried to do better, and I talked to, I think you cited Jessica as well, Hatrik. I talked to quite a few people for whom I had trust, which is also important. I mean, this is exactly what's happening right now with Kivu, actually, where I think many of us had on their social media something along the lines of Free Congo, there's a genocide in Congo, and I've been a little bit intrigued, I suppose, because I felt that the information around it was always a little bit too blurry, or a little bit too like blaming only one sort of entity, and so I've been spending the last 2 months essentially reading on the history of the Great Lake regions and going back to the history of the Rwandan of the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda, and so trying to understand better. And I don't understand better, but I understand better that I don't understand, and it's always very important this, and it's not a play on word. It's very important to understand you don't understand, and so yeah, I think this is something that I think the only couple of times where it was a little bit too big not to be addressed had to do with South America, yeah, and I completely get it, like, and I feel people were not even that aggressive about it, and yeah.
Thank you so much. So we've already started to get some great questions. I'm going to start with this one, which says, have you thought about how the decolonization efforts of your work could seep into the way we recognize and name countries and borders? On the one hand, we have to acknowledge our reality, and our current borders are a big part of the political spaces, but how can editorials and publications break them down? And I wanted to start with this because we were just at Roach Library looking at maps and atlases before coming here. So I know that cartography is a particular passion of yours. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, thanks to the person who asked that question. Um, yeah, I mean, I think first of all, there's in the Funambulist. I mean, I would not say the Funambulist is an anarchist, is necessarily influenced by an anarchist epistemology, but there is that in common that there is always a very high suspicion for the nation state as a model. And so that obviously means that probably the nation state's borders are also come under that same suspicion. Of course, settler colonial borders bear very little weight in the legitimacy we might think of them with, and so that means that that a very simple example might mean, like, for example, we think of Kashmir as its own country, like not as a part of India or Pakistan for that matter. When it comes to Palestine, that it means that we consider Palestine to be its own full entity, which means Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel as being its own
its own entity. So hence, from the river to the sea, that's what people don't seem are putting a lot of stubbornness in not wanting to understand. And yeah, I mean, cartography is also interesting because in a place like Algeria, the borders were literally mapped as they were being made by the French colonizers. So, and I think that obviously tackles some architectural question in how easy it is for architecture to embody a settler colonial border. I mean, you had an entire presidential campaign and probably a second one that was built on a architectural slogan, a 3-word architectural slogan: "Build that wall." Like, how simple is it to conceptualize such an idea, to take a settler colonial line traced in 1848 that totally cut indigenous nations' land, and to transform it into a wall? There's nothing simpler. So yeah, but as I said, also it's important to think of the border regime not as like this one line, this one wall, this, because that's also a fetish, and to see any detention center anywhere, or even an immigration desk at whichever international airport anywhere, as being part of the border regime, of course, and even the sort of feeling of permanent threats that an undocumented person feels every single day at in any given public space, as also being the border regime. I said I was not going to be long. And yeah. Well, I think that has to do with what the magazine is trying to do, and what the magazine is trying to do is not to convince anyone of anything, and so it's not at all. Um, yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, obviously, you probably understood that already. That it's not a two-sided kind of thing. It's like, oh, a dialectical. Okay, let's hear from there. Let's hear from that side, and then let's hear from that side. But even more so, I think it's trying to construct a we or us, um, in a way that, and so it kind of I mean, the only time this sort of like discomfort can potentially happen, and hopefully that's a productive discomfort, would be with will be with people who I mean, yeah, we would, for example, not really conceptualize the existence of other imperialisms than the U.S. imperialisms one, for example. So that would create some interesting conversation. But I think, um, even sometimes I remember some interesting conversations with some African American writers who wanted to write African American in a text when clearly actually they meant black people in the US, meaning the relationship to citizenship was not in any way important to distinguish compared to foreign black people in the US, or undocumented black people in the US, or black visitors in the US. And so to start sort of dismantling this automatism of going towards citizenship and the relationship to a nation state, which is totally, I mean, which I completely understand also. I mean, when you look at the history of the civil rights and everything, it is called civil rights. Like, it is about the obtention of rights for citizens. So I understand how it's been the paradigm of the black struggle for liberation in this country, for example, for many years. But I think it's also something that ought to be perhaps re-questioned vis-a-vis the millions of black people in the US who are not citizens, for example. So that would be one interesting thing, but I've never had pushback. Like it's always like, oh wow, okay, yeah, but or interesting productive pushback, because I mean, you know, who am I to also necessarily say this kind of stuff, and there might be my own blind spots as well within this kind of affirmation. So yeah, so I think the kind of contributors we ask to write in the magazine are people who are totally open to this kind of something I would not even call disagreement, something I would just call like coming from two different places, and yeah, it. I can't really even remember a moment where that would have been a little bit more conflictual, so to speak. Yeah.
I, by the way, if you do have questions written down, please pass them up. I think this question is from Roberto, and he wants to. Oh, sorry, I'm so sorry. What's your name? Alyssa. Okay, from Alyssa. He just handed it to me. Okay. Um, I think this is also interesting because I've noticed that in your um, sort of citations, you mentioned that there was a design model or a graphic identity that was developed by someone or a firm, and then there's been shifts in that graphic identity. So the question is asking you, can you describe the intention and strategy of the Funambulist visual identity? I noticed cases featuring collage, photography, graphic design, and archival images. What is the decision/commission process for your covers?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think within an architecture school, that's a fairly easy question to address, because I think I would doubt that anyone in this room really doesn't have a sort of aesthetic um, investment of sort. I think I mean, also everyone in this room understands that non-aesthetic doesn't exist. Like it's only white leftist things that they can do stuff that are ugly and things that it's not aesthetic in itself, when actually it is. Uh, um, so yeah, I think it's also, I mean, a little bit like I was saying, like architects being mediocre at everything is like it also involves a certain sense of composition, of graphic design, of an artistic sensitivity, and then also taking seriously the fact that art would be also another way to express similar arguments than text might be, and so but it's quite present within the magazine. But I have to say that within the pages, we're trying to limit the budgets to illustrations to a minimum. So many of the illustrations are Creative Commons, or sometimes when it's one image and I feel the person who made it is not an overly precarious person, I might ask uh, for a little bit of generosity for us to be able to use it. But then, yeah, for the cover, it's been quite a long time now that I've put aside a budget for each issue, in which because also the cover is what we, it's also the marketing side of things. So it's also important. In that case, that's very important that the people get paid. Also because quite often they're the one creating the piece for the issue, so it's literally work. It's not just reusing some of their work, and then it's a beautiful collaboration as well that leads to this series, and I quite like it. I wish we had a bigger budget to perhaps do that a little bit more systematically within the magazine itself. But yeah, it's been a little bit tough. Yeah, yeah. Prompts. Yeah, yeah. Because I will describe, because when, bear in mind, when they do the cover of the issue, when they create a new thing, they don't have the content of the issue. I have to describe to them what the issue is about, and it depends. I mean, it really depends. I think the most recent one on Prison Uprising, Lilia Ben Belaid, for example, it was quite. I had quite a precise idea of what I had in mind, and so it was quite prompted. But sometimes it's much more open-ended. So it depends also of. I think it also depends on whether the artist also is used to do a little bit of illustration work, and therefore being a little bit used to have quite a few prompts, or sometimes a little bit more artist, where you would say, okay, this is a topic, so you have carte blanche, so to speak. Yeah.
you. So we have three sort of related questions, which have to do with audience and readership. So there's a general question about asking the demographics, geography, and interests. But the other two are specifically dealing with architecture. So this question says, as the magazine grew towards less direct connections with architecture, especially in more recent issues, can you elaborate a bit more about the position and role of architecture in relation to the topics presented in the magazine? And the related question is, what do you see as the intended role of this as a journalistic project, and towards what intended audience? If it is to give architects the language with which to resist injustices, would their mediocre skills be better convinced to be spent on continued communication mediums rather than building buildings?
So maybe in the right order. Yeah, I mean the demographics of the readers is of course a little bit hard to establish. I mean sometimes you can kind of get a sense of, especially if you know a little bit the people, you can get a sense a little bit with people's names and everything. But yeah, so it's a little bit hard to do. I would say it's a fairly young audience, but yeah, it's a very global north anchored audience, like probably 96 or 7% of readers, which of course, readers, subscribers or paying readers, because that's where the open access. Like if we look at the stats of the websites, then it's completely different. We have many people from Turkey, from South Africa, from India, from Pakistan, from Palestine, from Brazil. But yeah, when it comes to actually, of course, subscribing, then we go back to what I was talking about the fact that it maybe here it for many people it didn't seem that expensive, but in many other contexts it would be. But then answering the two other questions, I think this has more to do with my own work as a writer, as a researcher, as someone who try to articulate arguments around architecture, its violence and its complicity with settler colonialism or heteropatriarchy or ableism or structural racism. Because my strategy for the magazine to speak to architects is not to speak to architects, at least not to do it in a prepackaged way, so to speak, and I think that's what also had made it perhaps liked by some within architecture, is to also not package things. It's not like, here, read this interview of Michel Foucault that talks about architecture, where actually he was not such in a great shape when he did this interview, and no, anyways, but me as a person, then I'm still very involved in trying to indeed push forward the complicity of architects and architecture, and dedicating those mediocre skills to communication and is certainly one of the ways to go at it. And I think it's not very fair to say communication in that case, but I think the entire paradigms that projects such as forensic architecture have opened, or maybe forensic architecture being maybe the most visible of the initiatives that tries to make visible those complicity, is one of the way to work with it. But as you know, one of the very first thing I said is that I still think design can be also a way to address this question, and it's just very difficult, because build that wall is a very easy thing to do, and so architecture has this propensity to control bodies and to oppress bodies in many ways, and of course oppress bodies in different way depending on which bodies we are talking about. But I'm also someone who believes that there's no architecture of emancipation. Like it's not, you cannot design an architecture and then people are like, yeah, we're free. Whereas you can design an architecture where people are like, oh, I'm in prison. Like that exists. So what is an architecture of resistance is a very complicated question. I think the most convincing examples of that are usually much more nuanced and subtle that I am able to think myself. So, but as I said, I think we have an entire generation of people involved in trying. I mean, some of them have decided not to be involved with design, but some do, and so this is also where I learn every day myself, seeing it.
I think this is also a really interesting and challenging question, and it has to do with the way that you solicit articles. And so the question says, it seems you are interested in the balancing act of reporting the vocal minority versus unheard majority from your percentage mapping act. Does this make you consider a different model from open call submissions? Would you consider deploying investigators? Question mark.
Well, first of all, I don't really think in terms of majority minority, because usually the people we think as majority are a very small minority in the world. So yeah, so I don't know. That doesn't really speak to me as a model. I think I'm more interested in thinking of people in struggle. And yeah, I mean the way the text operates is that it's almost exclusively commissioned. So meaning it's usually according to a certain topic with a certain editorial line that I try to articulate, is like asking specific people to write about one aspect of that editorial line, and I think that's what doing a good editorial job is about. But then of course it's about commissioning to people who would write like so much more powerful stuff that you would ever be able to in your own life, and so that's the main model. And then every now and then someone sends us a text, or a text. It's rare. It's very rare someone sends us a text and I'm like, okay, we're going to publish it, because I like the idea of working together towards a text. But someone sent us an ID, or I don't know, just this morning I met someone who's doing an amazing PhD, and I'm like, oh my God, what can we do? Well, how can we, I don't know, create an issue so that they would be in it. Yeah, but then I think it's about getting familiarized with people's work and all that, and again being always in a position of being open and accepting, and again like being particularly attracted to questions that are not really asked very often in my own mind, so to speak. So then that's when usually it really something beautiful happens, I suppose, and then that creates beautiful stories of collaboration, and then like many doors that open all of a sudden when they were closed all this entire time. But what's interesting is some doors are closed and they exist. So using a little bit of a Donald Rumsfeld kind of terminology, those are the known unknown. But sometimes you even have unknown unknown. So there's doors that are closed you don't even know they exist. So to actually address those blind spots, it's even harder because you don't even know they're there to begin with. So it's always a practice of continuous learning that makes also me loving my job. So quite simply, so as long as it will be like that, I think I'll still be around. Yeah.
Yeah, we have time for maybe one more question if anyone has anything they'd like to share, or I have a final question I can ask. Anyone? Yeah.
How do you envision the future of the Funambulist?
Yeah, thanks. You should come to our annual 2 days of thinking about this kind of questions. I mean, at a medium term, or even short to medium term, it's against continuing this translation effort, and actually, I can even share with you that the next issue, the May issue, will be also a way to address the fact that the languages we are translating into are still like very much imperial languages. I mean, you know, again, English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese, Hindi, Chinese, like all those languages exist at such, with so many locutors because they've been imposing themselves in quite often in a pretty violent way. So to me, and of course we do that because there's many, it involves many potential readers, so we want to our reach to be even bigger, and our the idea we're trying to articulate to be discussed in many different places. But to me, doing this without doing the balancing act of also thinking of other languages is something that I feel would be quite a big mistake. And so the next issue is going to be this really beautiful issue where I commissioned a text by indigenous writer Yasnaya Aguilar from the state of Oaxaca in Mexico about the politics of language. A very short text that that is being translated into 30 languages around the world and with different alphabets sometimes. And it's absolutely gorgeous to have them come in every day those days. So I'm quite excited about that. For example, I'm also excited about changing the form of for one issue, like to do something quite different, because this is a way to not bore the readers and not bore ourselves as well. But then the future, in perhaps a longer term, of course, would be to have a bigger team, and to have a space would be really a beautiful thing. Where I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, this is kind of my dream. Perhaps even a radio or something. But yeah, those are like way down the line.
I'm going to ask just a quick final question. So, you know, in the beginning when I was introducing you, I mentioned many of the contributors that are students and scholars, people that are very familiar to us. And I know you yourself dabble in pedagogy. You, from time to time, do teach at universities. I'm just curious, how do you see, or is there, but how do you see the influence of the funambulist in at least some of these global north universities where you have subscribers and readers and interlocutors? Do you think that there has been a shift? Because the funambulist is distinct from other architecture, let's say more mainstream journals and, you know, spaces.
It's an extremely hard question, and you know, I'm not a particularly humble person, so I don't think it's because I don't think it's because I refuse to indulge in the idea of having any influence on anything, because I think we probably do, but to be able to pinpoint exactly what it would be would be extremely hard. So if anything, there's probably hopefully a good amount of that room that has a better position to answer that question and what it might have done to them if they've been reading it for some years than I would myself. I just know, outside of the influence of the funambulist, outside of, I mean, not being able really to address this question, I just see how the discipline has been drastically changing. Not necessarily the mainstream of it, although to a certain degree still yes. But again, like to see like an entire new generation emerging, doing amazing project and everything, I have literally zero idea whether we had any influence on them or not, but I just know that they're there and it's amazing, and if we had a little bit of things to do with it, then that's fantastic. But I think I'm perhaps the worst person to answer that question.